On a quiet day in South Korea, skies that seemed calm would soon carry the weight of tragedy. My name is Jhon, and this is my channel Plane Crashed, where we uncover the haunting stories behind aviation's darkest moments. Today, we journey back to the story of Jeju Air Flight 2216, a flight that began like any other routine trip but soon turned into a nightmare no one on board could have imagined. From the cockpit's final decisions to the desperate moments of passengers, this is not just a crash, it's a story of human lives forever changed. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when Jeju Air Flight 2216 prepared for its journey. The airport lights gleamed on the wet tarmac, reflecting the silhouettes of ground crews as they moved with routine precision. For passengers, it was just another flight, one that promised to bridge the distance between their current lives and their next destinations. They boarded with the quiet chatter of everyday travelers, families, business people, students, and couples. For the crew in the cockpit, it was another night of responsibility, of managing the lives entrusted to them and guiding their aircraft safely across the skies of South Korea. Nothing about the atmosphere hinted at what was about to unfold. Inside the cockpit, the two pilots carried out their pre-flight checklists, their voices calm and professional. Switches were flipped, readings confirmed, procedures followed to the letter. The first officer read back instructions with precision, and the captain's responses carried the tone of seasoned confidence. Yet behind the calm, the smallest deviation, a gauge reading slightly off, a warning that flickered for a second too long, was already an omen. In aviation, a single anomaly can be the first thread pulled in a chain of disaster, and on this flight, that thread had begun to unravel as the aircraft taxied to the runway. Passengers settled into their seats, oblivious to the quiet tension mounting in the cockpit. The engines roared, thrust building with force that pushed bodies gently back into the seats. The wheels lifted from the ground, and the flight climbed into the night sky. To the passengers, it was routine. To the crew, it was another line in a logbook. But somewhere between ascent and cruising altitude, a fault began to surface. A warning tone pierced the cockpit, cutting through the calm hum of the systems. The pilots exchanged glances. Their voices, once composed, now carried a trace of urgency. A reading didn't make sense. Pressure levels fluctuated, and alarms began to illuminate their panels. In that moment, what had been a straightforward flight transformed into a battle against time. Machinery and fate. The captain's hands moved quickly across the controls, while the first officer called out the abnormal indications. They worked in sync, trained to react with calm precision, but aviation disasters often evolve faster than human reactions can keep pace. The fault they faced was not isolated, it was cascading. Each second that passed triggered a new response from the aircraft, alarms feeding into one another like dominoes falling in rapid sequence. The plane began to tremble, subtle at first, then stronger, the kind of vibration that made even experienced pilots tighten their grip on the controls. Down the cabin, passengers began to notice. Drinks rippled in cups, the overhead bins shuddered, and whispers of unease spread. Flight attendants, trained to mask their own fear, reassured passengers with forced smiles, but even they could feel that something was deeply wrong. The cabin air felt heavier, the noises around them louder, the sensation of control slipping away with every passing second. Some passengers gripped the armrests, others clutched loved ones, and many simply looked around for answers that no one could provide. In the cockpit, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The aircraft's automated systems conflicted with the pilot's manual inputs, creating a deadly tug-of-war between man and machine. The captain barked orders, the first officer responded with checklist items, but the warnings multiplied until they filled the small cockpit with a cacophony of alarms. Oxygen masks dangled in the cabin as pressure issues compounded, signaling passengers to strap them over their faces. Mothers struggled to calm children who cried in confusion, their voices drowned out by the hiss of the masks releasing. In the flight deck, the pilot's breathing grew heavier, voices breaking with strain as they fought to stabilize the jet. Every second felt stretched, elongated by fear. The aircraft pitched and rolled, banking more steeply than passengers had ever experienced. The horizon outside the windows tilted violently, city lights below becoming streaks of motion. Inside the cabin, screams erupted, prayers whispered, and fear took over. The attendants struggled to maintain order, but chaos had begun to overtake control. It wasn't just a malfunction, it was a storm of failures converging at once. Warnings of hydraulic pressure loss, electrical faults, and control issues all fused together into a scenario that no simulator could replicate in its entirety. Back in the cockpit, the captain's voice was calm but edged with desperation as he declared an emergency to air traffic control. His words, transmitted over the frequency, carried the weight of finality. They were losing control. Controllers on the ground scrambled to clear airspace, giving the jet priority, but in reality, the battle was already being fought in the skies. The first officer's voice cracked as he read off altitude readings that dropped faster than they should. The captain pulled at the controls, his strength against the stubborn machinery, trying to coax life back into an aircraft that no longer obeyed commands. In the cabin, time lost its meaning. Some passengers wept silently, clutching hands, while others sobbed openly, their fear filling the air. The vibrations grew violent, the overhead bins burst open and bags rained down. Flight attendants, now powerless, braced themselves alongside passengers, their professional calm shattered by the gravity of the moment. Every scream, every prayer, every gasp blended into a haunting chorus. The sound of lives suspended between hope and inevitable tragedy. Outside, the aircraft's descent became visible to those on the ground. Lights in the sky wavered, dipping lower and lower, until witnesses later described it as a falling star breaking apart. The engines howled, metal groaned under the stress, and the wings trembled as if they might rip free from the fuselage. In the cockpit, the captain made one last attempt, pulling with every ounce of strength, but the systems that once ensured safety now sealed their fate. The first officer's final words, clipped and broken, were lost in the chaos of alarms. A voice carrying the weight of realization that there was nothing left to do. The impact came with devastating force, shattering the silence of the night. The ground trembled, a fireball erupted, and lives that had been full of promise ended in an instant. The sound echoed far beyond the crash site, reaching into the hearts of families who would soon receive the call they feared most. Rescue crews rushed toward the wreckage, guided by the flames that illuminated the darkness. But in the immediate aftermath, survival was no longer the question. Loss had already defined the scene. Investigators would later piece together the final minutes, reconstructing every warning, every decision, every desperate action inside that cockpit. They would analyze the black boxes, listening to the final voices of the crew as they struggled against an impossible scenario. The transcripts revealed professionalism, courage, and the painful reality that sometimes even the best-trained pilots cannot overcome cascading mechanical failures. The public would learn of technical faults, of systems that failed when they were most needed, and of lives caught in the merciless grip of aviation tragedy. Yet beyond the technical reports and the analysis of failures, there remained the human element, the fear, the courage, and the fleeting moments of connection between passengers and crew in their final minutes. For every switch flipped in the cockpit, there was a child clinging to a parent. For every checklist called out, there was a family member whispering prayers. For every desperate attempt to regain control, there was a human soul hoping for a miracle that never came. The story of Jeju Air Flight 2216 became more than just an entry in the annals of aviation accidents. It became a reminder of the fragility of life, the unpredictability of machines, and the courage of those who fight until the very end. In the skies above South Korea, a routine flight transformed into a tragedy that would never be forgotten. The passengers who boarded that evening never imagined their journey would end in disaster, and the crew who guided them never stopped fighting for their safety. But the chain of failures left no escape. Today, as we revisit their story, we do so not to sensationalize the horror, but to honor the reality of what they endured. The Cockpit voice recorder captures their professionalism, their humanity, and their relentless determination in the face of catastrophe. And as we listen, we are reminded that behind every flight number is a story of people. Pilots who bear the burden of responsibility, passengers who entrust their lives, and families who wait for their safe return. Jeju Air Flight 2216 may have ended in tragedy, but its story lives on, etched into history as a somber chapter in the pursuit of safer skies. The story of Jeju Air Flight 2216 is not only about mechanical faults and cockpit warnings. It is about the people whose lives were bound to the flight, people whose ordinary routines carried them into extraordinary tragedy. The passengers who boarded that evening had no sense that they were stepping into history. To them, it was simply another journey, a means of connecting the dots between two places, a bridge across their personal stories. Yet those who boarded and those who waited for them would be forever bound by the cruel twist of fate that unfolded in the night sky. Among the passengers were families returning home after brief vacations, children with school bags slung over their shoulders, business professionals carrying laptops filled with contracts, and young couples planning futures that would never arrive. Each seat held a different story, and each story was about to be cut short. Yet within the final moments of terror, the humanity of those aboard shone brightly, the bonds between strangers, the comfort shared between families, the courage displayed in fleeting seconds of clarity. One passenger, a mother traveling with her young daughter, was seen by those nearby clutching her child tightly as the aircraft lurched and alarms filled the cabin. Witnesses would later recount how she whispered prayers and promises, shielding the child with her own body. In another row, a group of college students who had spent their trip laughing together now sat in stunned silence, holding each other's hands, their eyes wide as the cabin tilted violently. Near the rear, an elderly man bowed his head in prayer, lips moving silently, his faith anchoring him in those final, desperate moments. As the chaos unfolded, the cabin crew fought to maintain order. Flight attendants, trained to remain calm even in the face of disaster, moved through the aisle, shouting instructions, guiding passengers to secure their oxygen masks. Their voices, though shaken, carried strength, a final attempt to hold together a cabin unraveling in fear. Some attendants knelt beside crying children, helping them fasten masks, while others braced themselves, their own fear masked by duty. They knew the severity of the situation, but until the very last second, they carried themselves with courage that passengers would later describe as almost superhuman. Survivors, few as they were, spoke later of the strange clarity that overtook them in those final moments. The seconds before impact stretched endlessly, and in that suspended time, people turned inward. They thought of the ones they loved, of the calls left unanswered, of the moments they wished they had more of. Some whispered their last goodbyes into the darkness, hoping somehow their voices would reach beyond the wreckage. Others closed their eyes, surrendering to whatever would come. Fear and acceptance blended into a silence deeper than the chaos itself. When the crash finally came, the world outside erupted into fire and destruction. For those who did not survive, the story ended in that instant. For the survivors, shaken, broken, but alive, the story had only begun. Crawling from twisted metal and smoke, they emerged into a world that was both familiar and forever changed. The air reeked of fuel. The ground was littered with fragments of lives that had been whole only hours before. Flames illuminated the night as cries for help pierced the silence. Those who survived stumbled through wreckage in disbelief, calling out names, searching for loved ones, clinging to the hope that someone else had made it out too. Rescue workers rushed toward the burning wreckage, their faces set with grim determination. They pulled survivors from twisted seats, carried them away from the flames, and listened as sobbing voices cried out in pain and grief. The scene was chaos, but amidst the destruction, there was humanity. Firefighters risking their lives in the blaze, medics kneeling in the dirt to tend to wounds, locals arriving with blankets and water, offering what little comfort they could. In hospitals across the region, the survivors lay in beds, their bodies scarred, their minds trapped in the endless replay of what had happened. The sound of alarms, the violent shaking, the final screams, all haunted their nights. Interviews conducted later revealed the depth of trauma they carried. Some described feeling guilty for surviving when so many others had perished. Others spoke of the unbearable silence in their hearts, the absence of loved ones who had been beside them one moment and gone the next. For many, life after the crash was not about healing, but about learning to exist with the wound that would never fully close. Beyond the survivors, there were the families, the ones who had been waiting at the airport, watching the arrival boards, expecting reunions that never came. At first, confusion spread when the flight failed to land on time. Then came whispers of trouble. Phones rang unanswered. Hours stretched painfully until officials confirmed what they had feared most. The plane had gone down. In waiting areas, mothers collapsed into tears. Fathers demanded answers, and children clutched photographs of parents who would never return. The grief that descended on those families was immeasurable, a tidal wave of sorrow that consumed entire communities. Funerals followed in the days ahead, marked by photographs, flowers, and the overwhelming sound of weeping. Churches and community halls filled with mourners, candles lit in remembrance of lives cut short. Families spoke of dreams unfulfilled, of voices they would never hear again. A child who would never graduate, a husband who would never return home from a business trip, a grandmother whose laughter would never again echo at family gatherings. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of loss that stretched across the nation. But out of grief often comes determination. The tragedy of Jeju Air Flight 2216 forced questions to the forefront. What went wrong? How could it have been prevented? What must change to ensure it never happens again? Investigators pored over wreckage, combed through black box recordings, and dissected every second of the flight's final moments. Families demanded accountability, their grief sharpened into resolve. They wanted answers, but more importantly, they wanted assurance that their loved ones had not died in vain. The aftermath sparked reforms within South Korea's aviation industry. Safety protocols were re-examined, mechanical oversight tightened, pilot training adjusted to prepare for cascading failures that rarely occurred, but proved catastrophic when they did. Airlines across the region reviewed their fleets, inspecting systems with renewed urgency. Regulators issued stricter guidelines, and Jeju Air itself faced immense scrutiny. The memory of Flight 2216 became a benchmark, a reminder etched into every checklist, every inspection, every flight that left the runway thereafter. For survivors, the years that followed were filled with both healing and haunting. Some shared their stories publicly, hoping to honor those who had been lost. Others retreated into silence, carrying their pain privately. Support groups formed, families of victims and survivors coming together to share the unspoken bond that only tragedy can forge. They held memorials each year, gathering at sites of remembrance, their tears blending with prayers, their grief softened only by the knowledge that they did not mourn alone. The tragedy also left a mark on the nation's collective memory. Media coverage etched images of the wreckage into the public consciousness, while documentaries and reports kept the story alive for years to come. Schools, universities, and aviation institutions used the disaster as a case study, teaching future generations not just the technical lessons, but the human cost of complacency, of failure, of errors left unchecked. The story of Flight 2216 became not only history, but also a warning, a testament to the fragility of safety and the enduring importance of vigilance. For the families, however, no reform or regulation could erase the absence. Empty chairs at dinner tables remained as silent reminders. Photographs faded on walls, but memories refused to dim. Children grew up without parents, spouses faced lives of solitude, and parents carried the unbearable weight of outliving their sons and daughters. The world moved on, but for them time stood still, forever fixed on the night when the sky betrayed them. And yet, within the tragedy, there was resilience. Survivors spoke of how their lives, though scarred, carried new meaning. They lived not only for themselves, but for those who could not. They carried stories of last conversations, last embraces, last moments of courage. They became living memorials, reminders that even in the darkest moments humanity endures. The story of Jeju Air Flight 2216 is one of loss, but also of love. It is about the people who boarded the flight with everyday hopes and dreams, and about the families who were forever changed by its fall. It is about the survivors who clawed their way back into life, carrying with them the weight of memory. And it is about the way tragedy reshaped an industry, forcing it to look into its own failures and vow never to repeat them. When we tell this story, we do so not to dwell on the horror, but to honor the humanity that emerged from it. The passengers of Flight 2216 were more than statistics. They were children with bright futures, parents with endless love, friends with laughter that once filled rooms. Their stories remind us that aviation tragedies are not about machines alone, but about lives, about the fragility of every takeoff and landing, about the responsibility carried by those who keep us in the skies. Jeju Air Flight 2216 will forever be remembered not just as a crash, but as a turning point, a moment where grief demanded change,